What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're having a look at the latest game that was just played between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in the latest Freestyle Friday tournament. This game was really interesting. As we can see, the bishops are on B1, A1, A8, and B8. That means they are just slicing down the board. Both sides are likely to go, say, B3, B4, C3, C4, and so on, activating those bishops. And sure enough, in the game, one C4 was played, activating this light squared bishop for Hikaru. Now Magnus goes 1b6, opening up the long diagonal for his light squared bishop. Also a very solid idea. Then we have d4 trying to seize control of the center. And here Magnus goes f5. Now f5 is sort of a rare move in classical chess. You don't see it all that often, but in freestyle chess, this move is being played just left and right. It is a very common idea for white and black. Both c5 and f5 are played all the time. All right, here already on move 3, Hikaru, he's got quite the decision, and in this position, he plays a move that turns out to be kind of a massive mistake. He plays the move d5. Now, this move at first glance makes a lot of sense. You lock in and entomb that bishop on the a8 square, but as you can see by the eval bar collapsing on the left, the computer does not like this move one bit. Now, the problem with this move, I had to do some investigating. Black can go e6 or e5, threatening queen b4 check, and that check against the king is actually really uncomfortable. There's not an easy way to block it. The only way to block it would be rook d2. So either e6 or e5 immediately would be taking advantage of this move d5, and of course with the pawn on, say, d4, these moves would not make as much sense. But instead here, Hikaru knight d6 was played, letting Magnus off the hook. All right, Magnus b3, opening up the long diagonal for his dark squared bishop. Certainly a solid move for white here. Black goes knight to f6, developing his knight. Then we have knight to f3, and then finally here, Magnus e6 is the move. But of course, with the knight on d6, he's blocking the path of the queen, meaning queen b4 ideas are not going to be possible, at least not in the near future. Now here, Hikaru, all he needs to do to maintain a very solid game is simply trade pawns on e6. Not a very complicated move to find. You trade the pawns, black takes back, and you've got a fine game. But instead here, Hikaru, he actually goes e3. Now, let's do math. That pawn is being attacked 1, 2, 3 times by the bishop, the pawn, and the knight, and it's being defended only 1, 2 times by the pawn and the rook. That means here, black has the opportunity to simply win a pawn, and that is what Magnus does. So we have e takes d5, c takes d5, and then knight takes d5, winning a pawn on d5 essentially for free. I mean, what did Hikaru actually get in return for that pawn? Well, he does have two very active bishops on a1 and b1. Of course, the dark squared bishop on b8, not nearly as active as the dark squared bishop on a1. But beyond that, Hikaru doesn't really have a lot of compensation for that pawn. He's already in quite a bit of trouble. All right, Hikaru, queen d3, flying up with the queen and pressuring the pawn on f5. Of course, for now, it is more than defended by the knight and the queen, so not really a threat yet. Black goes queen d7, a decent square for the queen, setting up short castles if he needs it. Of course, Magnus can also castle long on the queen side. That's also an option, so he's got some flexibility. Now, Hikaru, knight to e2, developing his knight, while also, again, keeping the pathways open for these bishops as much as possible. And here Hikaru, he's got the option of castling long or on the king side. Now, turns out long castles here is the best move, but instead of that, he actually goes, for Magnus, turns out here he has the option of castling long or short, and long castles is technically the best move because, again, these bishops and the queen are just putting too much pressure on the king side, but instead here, he actually castles on the king side. So short castles on the king side played in the game. Now Hikaru, he castles king side as well. Solid move. And now Magnus c5. Now, so far, Hikaru, I mean, yes, he is down a pawn, but he's starting to get some compensation. The d file is very vulnerable. White has a lot of pressure here. These knights on d5 and d6 are quite vulnerable. And again, these knights on d5 and d6 are quite... These knights on d5 and d6 are quite vulnerable here. And again, white's got a lot of pressure with these bishops. All right, from here, we have the move, knight to g3, jumping out with the knight. Now black jumps down with his knight, knight to b4, pressuring the queen on the d3 square. Now the queen does need to retreat. We have the move queen to e2, sliding back with the queen, and then knight to e4, jumping in with the dark squared knight. Now here we have the black's knight. Now here, a3 drives back the knight on the b4 square. We have the move bishop takes g3, giving up the bishop for the knight. H takes g3, and now of course the knight on b4 is still under attack, and Magnus does retreat it. Knight to c6 played in the game. Now, so far, we're only 14 moves into this game, but both sides have chewed up a lot of their time. We're down to less than a minute and 20 seconds left on the clock for both players. That means both sides, already 14 moves in, have used up the majority of their time in this game. It's going to be a crazy battle from here in time pressure. Alright, Hikaru, b4 is the move, trying to get something going on the queen side, but this move is very strange looking to me because black here has the option of taking on b4 and then recapturing with the knight or the queen. In the game, he doesn't do that. Instead, here, d5 was played by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen, and now Hikaru, he trades on c5. B takes c5. That was the idea of b4 after all. Now we have b takes c5, recapturing back. Then knight d2 retreats the knight and puts some pressure on the black knight on the e4 square. Now black goes knight to e5, jumping in with his knight. And here, white's got a lot of different options. You can trade on e4 with the knight. That is playable. You can also go queen to h5, bringing out the queen to the king side. That is also playable. But instead, in the game, bishop to a2 was played, trying to exert some pressure on this diagonal. But this move here turns out is very, very dubious. This move, bishop a2, was actually quite good earlier in the game. But here, Magnus, he simply goes c4, cutting off the bishop on a2. That bishop now literally biting on granite. And here, Hikaru, immediately drops back bishop b1, trying to reroute it to a better diagonal. All right, here, black, bishop c6 is the move, getting the bishop off that back rank. Then we have knight to f3, developing the knight and pressuring the knight on the e5 square. Now here, black goes knight g4, jumping out with his knight, putting a lot of pressure on the white position. And here, white again has some different options. The best moves for white include trying to find a better square for this knight on f3. Knight to h4 and knight d4 are the top engine lines here. But instead, bishop takes e4 played in the game. This is very controversial. You are giving up your very important light squared bishop for that knight on e4, and this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake here. Black takes back with the f-pawn, and now look at this. Black exerting a lot of pressure on this f-file, especially on that pawn on f2, and this knight on f3, of course, is going to have to move, opening up the attack even further. All right, now here, the two best moves for white include knight to h2 and especially knight h4. h4 once again being a very ideal square for that knight, but instead, knight d4 played in the game, and here, Magnus, bishop d7, simply retreating his bishop, bolstering the knight on the g5 square, or g4 square, and he's doing excellent. All of his pieces are coming into the attack. The queen's going to go to, say, g5. The rook may go to f6, then h6, and so on. Black's got a lot of ideas here. All right, Hikaru, rook d to e1. He's got to find some way to defend. Black goes rook d to e8, improving the placement of his rook as well. Now here, the best moves for white include queen d2 and f3. Is very important to play one of those moves here in this position, because if you don't, black's attack is going to just pick up immediately. And here he makes a big mistake. Knight c2, dropping back the knight. The idea being he's trying to open up the scope of this dark squared bishop. But here, Magnus, again, he is not slowing down. Queen to g5. All of his pieces are entering into the attack. I mean, look at the wonderful placement of all his pieces versus white. It's amazing how even in freestyle chess, Magnus always seems to get these amazing squares for his pieces. All right, here, white goes f3, gaining space on the king side, of course, chopping down on that pawn on the e4 square. Black takes, white takes back, and now all of white's pawns are on the third rank instead of the second rank. This means his king on g1 is very, very vulnerable. There's all this dead space in front of the king. That is not something you want when you are defending. Now here, black has the option of just taking on e3, and it turns out, for tactical reasons, that does work out. For example, if you go knight takes e3 and white takes back, then rook takes e3, and you are doing excellent with the big attack. Now, instead of that here, in this position, knight to e5 was played, dropping back with the knight. Now we have queen g2, the queen slides over, and then knight d3. This is the idea of Magnus. The knight retreats, then it infiltrates on the d3 square, pressuring the rook on e1. Not a bad idea at all. Hikaru slides the rook out of the attack. Rook b1 is the move, and then we have rook b8 challenging the white rook on b1. So far, Magnus Carlsen up a pawn in this position. He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns over to the 4 pawns of white. He's also got a little bit of an attack, but so far, Hikaru, he does seem to be hanging on so far in this game. All right, now here, Hikaru has got to do something about all of this pressure on the king side. The best way to relieve the pressure right now is the move f4, gaining space and driving back the queen. Instead, in the game, g4 was chosen. Now, this move's a little bit funky. It's trying to cut off the bishop and trying to, gain control of some important squares on the king side. But again, this does create even more dead space in front of the white king. All right, now here we have queen to g6. The queen slides back 1 square. Bishop d4 centralizes the bishop and pressures the pawn on the a7 square. Now here, black goes rook b3, flying in with the rook to a very, very active square. And of course, if white takes, black is going to take back, and his passed pawn on b3 will be very, very strong, pressuring the knight, threatening to just simply march down the board to the b1 square. Instead of that, rook b d1 played in the game by Hikaru, a split-second decision, spending 1 second on the clock, maybe 2 if you count the increment, the 1 second increment. All right, now Magnus, a5, gaining space on the queen side, and of course, getting his pawn out of the attack of the bishop on d4. A solid choice. White goes rook to d2, and then we have the move h6, gaining space on the king side and potentially giving his king an extra retreat square on h7. Not a bad idea, especially in time pressure, sort of a waiting move. Now, there were stronger moves. For example, the immediate c3 is actually very, very strong in this position, but instead, h6 played in the game. Now we have knight to e1. The knight drops back and pressures the knight on the d3 square. Black goes rook to c8, bolstering his c-pawn, threatening ideas like simply c3, c2, c1, promoting to a queen. That would be very, very strong. Now white takes on d3. Knight takes d3. We have c takes d3, and then rook f to f2. The rook lifts up and tries to defend along the second rank. Now here, Magnus, rook takes a3 is the move. Again, Magnus just simply taking over in this game. He's now up 2 pawns. He's got 2 extra passed pawns that are both very well defended in this position. Hikaru, again, he's got his work cut out for him to defend. Now white goes king to h2, getting his king off the back rank. We have rook to b3. The rook slides over, making way for the a pawn to march down the board. Now here, Hikaru, f4 is the move, trying to make something here. And here, this move, it simply gives up the defense of the pawn on g4. Queen takes g4 is the best and the simplest move, but Magnus in time pressure, instead of that, he goes queen to e4, also offering the queen trade. But this move, it doesn't capitalize on the weakened pawn on g4, kind of a strange move. And Hikaru, he keeps the queens alive. Queen g1, not a bad move at all. Black goes rook to c2, flying down with the rook. White goes g5, and then black is going to go h5, gaining space on the king side. Now we have the move g6. White also gaining space, trying to keep the g file, not closed, but trying to give his queen perhaps access to that g5 square if he needs it. Now black, bishop g4, making very good use of the advanced alpha 0 h pawn on h5. The bishop is defended. And again, Magnus here, look at all of his pieces. It's absolutely disgusting. The queen, the bishop, the rooks slicing down, the passed pawns on d3 and a5. Magnus just getting Hikaru in a massive tangle here. All right, Hikaru, queen g3. Both sides have less than 10 seconds left on the clock, by the way. Literally anything could happen from here. All right, rook takes d2 is the move, trading a pair of rooks. We have rook takes d2, and then queen takes g6. Magnus now up 3 pawns in this position. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus the 1-2 of Hikaru. How could Magnus possibly lose this game except for time pressure? We have queen to h4. The queen slides up, king to h7, then queen to e7. The queen infiltrating into black's side of the board. Now we have a4. The pawn advances, rook to g2. The rook slides over, a3, the pawn advances once again, and then the move f5, gaining space on the king side. Of course, the queen is under attack. You cannot take the pawn, as if you do take the pawn, queen g7 would be checkmate on the spot. For example, queen takes f5 is met by queen takes g7. That would be a nasty way to lose the game. You don't want to do that. So after f5, queen to h6 was played in the game. That is the only good move to maintain the defense of that pawn on the g7 square. Now we have the move f6. Hikaru, I mean, this guy is fighting with everything he's got. Of course, the idea being the pawn on g7 is now pinned by the queen to the king. Therefore, g takes f6 is not a possibility. What is black to do? Here we have move rook to b8. The rook flies back to the back rank. White goes f7, gaining even more space on the king side, threatening f8, promoting to a queen. And now, I do want to point out, I missed this. Excuse me. Here in this position, rook b8 was a massive... And now here, Magnus, he's got to find one very, very precise move to keep the advantage in this game. That is going to be the move queen to g5, effectively pinning the pawn on f6 to the queen on e7. After queen g5, if you go f7, you lose the queen on e7. That is the idea. Now, instead of that, in the game, rook to b8 was played, and this move allows f7, and now there's nothing stopping this pawn from promoting. White is potentially winning. Hikaru Nakamura might be swindling this game away from the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. All right, Magnus, a2 is the move. He pushes his pawn down the board. White goes f8, promoting to a queen. Black here has to take. We have rook takes f8, then queen takes f8, gobbling up that rook, and then queen to g5. Again, white has all the pressure with the rook, the bishop, and the queen effectively all piling up on this pawn on g7. Now white, queen to f2. He retreats the queen, of course, the bishop on d4, covering the a1 square. And Hikaru, given that he's up a rook, black only has 4 pawns for the rook. Here, Hikaru is essentially borderline winning here. We have queen e7, Magnus trying to defend. And now here, the best move for white is going to be queen g3, but he misses it. He goes king to g1. This is a significant blunder in time pressure. Now the right response is queen to b4, threatening queen b1, and then a1, promoting to a queen, trying to win the bishop on d4, as the bishop would have to give itself up for the new queen on the a1 square. But instead, here, queen to c7 was played, and this move allows simply queen to b2. And now there is simply no way to force through the pawn. And in this position, Magnus Carlsen, it's a roughly even position, but he actually taps out on time. He loses in time pressure. He has no time left on the clock. And Hikaru Nakamura, he also has less than 1 second. I mean, we're down to less than 1 second, and Magnus runs out of time on the clock. This is just unbelievable stuff here. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in this freestyle chess game from the Freestyle Friday tournament that happened. I believe this video will be up on Saturday, so that happened yesterday. Wow, very impressive stuff by these two players. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, comment down below in terms of what you thought of this game. Smash that like button, and I keep saying this, but I've got some very big changes coming to this channel. This is going to become more of an educational channel, and I'm going to have a school community live very, very soon where you can interact directly with me, ask all your questions. I'm going to have a ton of educational content for you guys, weekly coaching calls, all kinds of stuff. So stay tuned for that coaching program. I promise it is coming. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video.